This is a sports channel. I talk about sports things. I play sports games. But today, we're talking about pro wrestling. But wait. Even if you're not a wrestling fan at all, even if you hate the business, which I did until about 6 months ago, you're gonna care about this. Wrestling is becoming bigger and more mainstream than ever, and there are now two massive wrestling shows on two networks that do tons of mainstream sports. With AEW Dynamite hitting TNT and WWE SmackDown going to Fox, it's impossible to separate wrestling from mainstream sports any longer. But what we've seen over the last year are the two forms of entertainment blending more than ever before. And believe it or not, it's actually helping both sports grow and reach bigger audiences. And that's the question we've set out to answer. How have sports and pro wrestling become so intertwined? Let's start with those two big moves that I mentioned earlier. SmackDown is headed to Fox. You know, the place that does football, they do baseball. They're a real sports network. And not only is SmackDown going there, they've talked about doing, in fact, they're going to do a talk show, specifically a WWE talk show on Fox Sports 1. That's a 24/7 sports network. So you can't deny that the WWE is moving into more of a sports focus. AEW, on the other hand, is headed to TNT, a network that does baseball, basketball, soccer, etc. So they're moving to a place that has a huge sports background, a lot of following. It's a place that used to have wrestling 2 decades ago. But it's not just that. When it comes to WWE, their superstars are now starting to have real crossover appeal. And I'm not just talking about like Brock Lesnar, who fought in the UFC, things like that. I'm talking about a guy like Kofi Kingston, who's been in the WWE basically his whole life. It's not like he's ever been a mainstream athlete, so to speak. But he is getting interviews on shows on FS1, on places like ESPN+. People know who Kofi Kingston is. So he's really getting some of that crossover appeal that we only saw from superstars in the past like Steve Austin and The Rock. And that it wasn't even through sports. It wasn't through sporting networks. It was just being a celebrity. People knew who Hulk Hogan was because he was a celebrity. It's the same way you knew who Robert De Niro was, even if you hadn't seen any of his movies. He was a celebrity. But what we're seeing is that these types of athletes are now becoming more mainstream, partially or mostly because the brands themselves are actually starting to become more sports focused in the way that they book their matches, in the way that they deliver stories. It's all about more of a sporting focus than it has been before. Let's talk about All Elite Wrestling, the new darling on the wrestling scene, and the first promotion in probably about 2 decades that has had the financial ability to compete with the giant of WWE. And they're doing it not by doing what the USFL did to compete with the NFL, which is basically do the same thing and just hope that people switch over, but they're actually trying to change the game, and they're doing that by becoming more sporty, quote unquote. They're keeping records of their wrestlers, which the WWE has never done. And they're actually awarding the title and championship shots to their wrestlers based on their record. So for example, Cody Rhodes is getting an AEW title opportunity at their upcoming pay-per-view because his record is so good, and they've gone on the record and said that.
We want to honor the wins and losses.
Now obviously, they decide who wins, so the record doesn't really mean anything, but the fact that they're making a mention of it really says it all, in my opinion, even if it's not real, right? Well, the WWE, on the other hand, they haven't really gone so far as to show records. But what they have done is they've started to change their presentation a little bit to mimic what we would expect to see from like a combat sport. So look at NXT, their quote-unquote developmental brand, that just got a TV deal on the USA Network, they've now added a tail of the tape graphic before every match. It's exactly what you would expect if you watch UFC or something like that. Let's talk about how wrestling is starting to change the sports world. Because it is, even if you don't really see it. Let me say one name. Conor McGregor. Everybody knows who Conor McGregor is. He's earned that. He's one of the most decorated, most successful UFC combat sports athletes of all time, right? But let's talk about some of the guys who are as decorated or possibly more decorated than Conor McGregor. Tito Ortiz, George St. Pierre, Royce Gracie. If you are not following the UFC, if you're not an MMA fan, if you've never seen it before, you probably haven't heard of most of those guys, if any of them. But you've still probably heard of Conor McGregor. It's because Conor changed the game in so far as he brought the storylines of his fight outside of the fight themselves, and he made it mainstream. Think about his fight with Jose Aldo. They were talking about that months before it happened, and the story was outside of the physical fight itself. Obviously, Nate Diaz, and then it escalated more with Khabib. And so you can argue about whether that's good or bad for the sport however much you want, but you can't deny that the UFC in particular is becoming so wrapped up in its storylines and its characters. Sounds a bit like wrestling, right? The characters aren't manufactured. These are how fighters really are. At least that's what they would want us to believe. And it's not like the UFC goes to them and says, we want you to do this, we want this story to happen. But that doesn't necessarily stop them from realizing that something is happening, this rivalry between Conor and Diaz, and saying, you know what, let's play up on that. People want to see that. So they're basically just a boardroom away from how the WWE does it, how wrestling does it. They just manufacture those in a writer's room or something else like that. Not only that, but we've become pretty accustomed to seeing references to professional wrestling in our mainstream sports. I mean, let's talk about guys who use The Undertaker's song as their walk-up song in the MLB. We talk about numerous references to Ric Flair, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. Those guys obviously are big celebrities, but how did they get that way? Right? It's not like Steve Austin was a movie star and then he went to wrestle. It's not like The Rock was a movie star and then he went to wrestle. He wrestled first. Those two guys wrestled at the same time. Ric Flair wrestled in the 70s and 80s. So the fact that people now are still thinking about him, he's still so much in the public eye. These guys are celebrities. They're celebrities like athletes are. They become part of the public discourse. Maybe not to the same degree, but it still does happen. And then let's talk about the commercial that Fox has been running on a lot of their sports programs that feature all kinds of real-world references, although obviously played up for the camera, about the wrestlers that you know, that we've probably heard of. Or Becky Lynch's series of This Is SportsCenter commercials on ESPN. But why is all of this important? So far, I'm just telling you how these two businesses, how these two forms of entertainment mesh, but why does it matter? Well, if you're a wrestling fan, we're starting to move into a world where wrestling is becoming more of a sport than it's ever been. It's never going to get to a situation where they're not deciding who wins. I mean, that's just straight up dangerous. So there's going to be scripting within matches. It's never going to be a true sport, a true competitive sport the way we know it. But the idea that the matches are going to progress more like a sporting event. It's not going to be the classic Hulk Hogan gets beat down by the bad guy and then he hulks up and does his moves and then he wins because he's the babyface, he's the good guy. It's becoming less and less of that. AEW has even said it outright. They're not doing the 100% babyface, 100% heel dynamic that has been the reality of wrestling basically for the entirety of the business. When it comes to the records, when it comes to the tail of the tape, the presentation is also starting to look like more sports oriented than it's ever been. So you can like that or not, but it is happening. If you're a traditional sports fan, the amount of connection that we have to athletes and teams through social media means that sports is more of a story outside of the field of play than it's ever been. And I bet you could think of 10, 20, 30 different things about athletes, about teams that are happening off the field that we never would have known about even 15, 20 years ago, before the advent of social media. Guys like Antonio Brown became a massive name because of what they did off the field. If you look at his numbers, they're comparable to Julio Jones. But who is the bigger name right now? I mean, it's hard to really define that, but if I had to just ask you, who is the bigger star, or who was the bigger star 2 months ago, I mean, before Antonio Brown did everything that he's doing, you'd probably say Antonio Brown, right? So you're seeing the evolution of the way that we treat athletes, the way that stories progress outside of just what happens on the field of play and what we are told by our newspaper or sports center or something like that. Athletes can craft their own stories now, and it's looking like the rivalries between athletes, the way that when Khalil Mack leaves the Raiders, it's a big story when he comes back because he's doing all of these interviews and it's being posted on Twitter and on all these places. It kind of feels like pro wrestling in a way. I'm not saying that the two are going to completely mix. I'm not saying that traditional sports are going to start being scripted, that the MLB is going to start deciding that they want the Yankees to win the World Series, so they're going to stack it that way. And I'm not saying that wrestling is going to become MMA, where they're not scripting fights, and so guys are doing double backflips off of the top turnbuckle while the other guy thinks that he's going to punch him in the mouth. I'm not saying that those things are going to happen. I'm just saying that we're watching the two forms of entertainment blend more than we've ever seen. And whether you like it or not, it's something that's happening right now, and it's going to continue to happen. Whether you're a wrestling fan, whether you're a sports fan, or even if you're both like me, it's something that the world is becoming. And I think there's advantages and disadvantages, just like anything else that's happening. But hopefully through watching this video, you'll become a little bit more keen to how these two things are blending and why it's happening. And maybe it'll just make the whole thing even more interesting for you to watch. So we appreciate you watching this video. As always, subscribe for all of General Admission's content now and in the future. We appreciate you guys. We'll see you next time.